Today. The first speaker is Dr. Salman Hussain, Coordinator for Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity and Head of the Economics of Nature Unit, UNEP. I request Dr. Salman to occupy the dais. Please give him a big clap. Salman Hussain is his research for the past decades has focused on ecosystem economics. He joined in UN Environment in 2014. Since then, TEB has developed the highly innovative and influential agriculture and food work stream in collaboration with inter alia, the FAO. He worked with UN Statistical Division for complementing the application of macro accounting called SEEA System of Environmental Economics Accounting, Experimental Ecosystem Accounting. I invite Dr. Dubat Chowdhury, an independent consultant and facilitator, former Chief Scaling Officer of ICMO, to the dais. For over 3 decades, Dr. Chowdhury has been working among the marginalized mountain communities of Himalayas, which focus on natural resource management, policy and market-driven transformations, climate change, adaptation and resilience building. His significant contribution includes drafting the Scheduled Tribes and Other Forest Dwellers Bill, providing technical expertise to adapting FAO's tool for agroecology performance evaluation, which is called TAPE, the development of the IPFS outcome framework, and is a member of Regent and Expert Network. I have got a primer of his presentation a month ago when we did a consultation in Guwahati. I was so impressed by that. Welcome, Dr. Dubat. I welcome Dr. Brent Loken, the Global Food Lead Scientist, WWF. Brent Loken provides thought leadership throughout forwarding-looking research, science, direction for goal setting, scientific analysis and supporting of strategy development. Previously, Brent was working in EAT. His current work includes report on food consumption pattern in G20 countries and the potential for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. As part of global science, Brent is bridging the technical and conservation practice worlds, synthesizing information from a wide range of food, agriculture, nutrition, and environmental disciplines. Let's give a big clap to Brent. Welcome, Brent. I was requesting Brent to join us, and I tried to tempt him, saying that this is a 3-day event. He can meet around 100 speakers, but he opted to be online. But Brent, hope we, very soon he will join us, to talk more about the WWF work. And you are doing another summit in India. Welcome. So briefly, I'm introducing, and we will go into 3 presentations one by one, and we will open up the floor for a couple of questions as the time available. Any transformation needs basically, a policy change and a behavioral change. And the policy change basically come from the governments and private sector, behavior from the, the communities. In a capitalistic economy, the policy of the private sectors are also, very, very important as far as the food system transformation is concerned. How these policies are changed? These policies are changed by, by certain, knowledge, continuous knowledge, flow towards the policy makers and the support for them to gather the latest cutting edge knowledge from the ground. This event is actually basically the search of where these gems of knowledge are. Sometimes these gems are lying in those situations which are not directly visible. We may need a little more effort to bring up. I'm not talking about these presentations, but we are considering the knowledge which is lying in the grassroots level, knowledge which is lying in this national and international level organizations and experts in the same level. So, it's a mix and match of this knowledge which can be used for policy changes. So the TEEB, the Economics of Ecosystem and Biodiversity, it talks about actually, it's really talks the economic language which ecologists very rarely speaks or reluctant to speak. I really like the brackets, Salman, like the nature capital, produced capital, human capital, and social capital, the brackets which are very easy for any civil society organizations working in the food system to put their impact into. I don't want to kill the spirit of the show. Rather than explaining more about TEB, I would like to invite Salman for the presentation. Welcome, Salman.
Could we put the slideshow up? It's going up. Okay, fantastic. Thank you very, very much for the invitation. So I did get my visa. I was born in Pakistan. I'm a UK citizen. So there were 4 people helping me at the consulate at 6:30. The consulate closed at 5:30, so my thanks to them. So I got here, but it was touch and go. So it's a great pleasure being here. Thank you so much for the invitation from the organizers. So I'm going to talk a bit about this famous acronym TEEB, and also talk about what we're doing in terms of food system transformation within UNEP, but also partnering with other UN entities in the country team in India and further afield. So I'm going to start with a bit of context. Now, I'm an economist, so you have to, at least there's no maths, right? So this is good. This is just a figure. But this is, I think, in summary, pretty much what we do. And it was a very interesting introduction because you talked really about the rules of the game, what we call, Milton Friedman called the rules of the game. So what exactly is a regulatory and fiscal environment in which agribusinesses, consumers, farmers, farm producer organizations, what's the regulatory fiscal environment in which they operate? Now, there are 2 sides to our work in TEEB Agri-Food. One of them is business, the other is public sector, but I'm going to talk mainly today about the public sector work. And this is a really simple schematic I put together a few years ago, which hopefully will help explain what we try to do. And it's the difference between financial and economic. Fundamentally, I think almost everyone in the room will recognize the social and environmental impacts and externalities, as we call them in economic terms, that food systems bring about. Okay? We know food systems, if well operated, can create community cohesion. We know they can destroy community cohesion. We know they can foster ingenuity. We know they can stifle opportunities and ingenuity. We know that equally we're highly dependent on the quality of our ecosystems in order to actually produce food at all. So all of those elements, the social and environmental, are typically hidden. And that's where TEEB kicked off. So before we started focusing on food systems, we said, what exactly are the hidden benefits that nature provides? And to what extent are we going about systematically making the wrong decisions day in, day out? And the answer is frequently and across all sectors, economic sectors. Now, we're doing this particularly in terms of the food sector. Why? Because we know the impacts and dependencies on nature are particularly high. But for an economist, fundamentally, this figure says the following. If as an economist, you account for and value in economic terms, that means either in monetary terms or non-monetary, those environmental and those social externalities, if you find that you will probably find, I should say, my working hypothesis, that something like intensive monocropping is no longer the best option. It might be financially the best option, but it's not the best option to include social environmental externalities. It may well be that agroecological approaches are exactly what you ought to be doing. And to stress, what they ought to be doing them for economic reasons. Of course, we should promote agroecology for community cohesion. We should promote it to improve biodiversity. All the nice things in society are intangible. But tangibly, these are contributing to our economy, to our livelihoods. And once TEEB and our partners put that on the map, it changes what exactly is the appropriate rules of the game. It changes what the regulatory framework should be. And that's what we're trying to do in India as we're trying to do in other countries. So this is, I mean, we probably have a new framework like on food systems, like guessing once a week or once a month at the most, right? Our framework is so to speak new. It was actually launched in 2018 at the World Environment Day in Delhi. So it has a Indian origin, so to speak. Our study lead is Pavan Sukhdev, who many of you will know, who's also Indian by nationality. But that aside, the fact is our framework was launched. Why? Because fundamentally, most agricultural research today, as was the case in 2018, as was the case 2 decades ago, focuses on what you see up here. It focuses how can we improve breeding technology, irrigation technology, the use of labor inputs to increase efficiency in our systems. That research is important and remains important. But what we're doing in terms of TEEB Agri-Food is what you see primarily in the bottom left. It's basically the ecosystem services that we depend on. And even if a farmer, even if an economist who isn't trained in this area doesn't talk about ecosystem services, that farmer will know how important soil retention is. That farmer will know how important hydrological services are. That farmer, in some cases at least, will know how important pollination is. Now, we take these invisible benefits for granted. Now, if we were taking them for granted and they weren't being depleted, then it doesn't matter. But that isn't the case. We know that agricultural encroachment, the way we're growing food, is impacting on our ecosystems. So we are focusing on this invisible side of the equation and including also the health impacts in the top right of this diagram, which I'll come to a bit later. Taking it more widely, we're taking a whole food systems approach. So we're looking at within farm gate, but also looking all the way through to final waste disposal. And we're looking at all of these capitals as mentioned. So the natural capital is what's providing these ecosystem services. The social capital is the communities that you in the room are working with and whose cohesion you require to produce food. And the ingenuity and the technology is part of the human capital. And the produce we know about. That's what appears in the national accounts. Okay. So this is part of a global venture. We started this in 2014 to the Tea Baggery Food, launched the framework in 2018. This is a cutting, so to speak, or a screenshot from the SOFA report. The FAO in Rome has an annual publication, it published for more than 80 years, called the State of Food and Agriculture Report. And for 2023 and 2024, for the very first time, it's on the same topic. And that's on true cost accounting, which is what we're doing. And this study, which is in the SOFA report for FAO, is the one I'm going to talk about a bit later for Thailand, just to give you a flavor for the kind of work we do. We also have published and tried to mainstream this across the G20. So this actually wasn't when India had the presidency. This is when Indonesia had the presidency, but we produced a T20 paper on this, trying to mainstream this. And we've also been involved very recently with the Brazilian presidency on payments for ecosystem services, which is linked, and also bioeconomy, which is linked as well. So I want to just give you a flavor, because I've got that long into the TEEP studies, and I'm going to go quite far away from here. I'm going to pick Thailand, partly because it's a kind of completed study, and I like the way that we get the final results. I'll then transition to India, what we're doing in India. I'll start with the map. This is where we're working, okay, just so you've got a global perspective. But let me give you an idea of the Indonesian, the study in Thailand. And this is linked because when we come to India work, we'll see we're focusing on organic as well. So here we're organic production and rice production in Northeast Thailand, funding by ICI, which was completed. And we had a follow-up study to this as well. What were we looking at? And this 3 or 4 slides describes our modus operandi. How do we make this case to change the regulatory framework? Okay, we start by asking decision makers, what is a viable scenario for us to evaluate? Where are you lacking evidence where you might potentially trigger a change in how things are done? You haven't done it yet, but were we to give you that evidence in UNEP, it might just tip things over. So we normally hear about bad tipping points like climate tipping. It's a good tipping point, right? In a sense that where would our work additionally cause you to have further justification, say, to promote organic agriculture? So in the case of Thailand, there was already an initiative, and you'll see later in India, of course, there are many initiatives in organic. There was an initiative called the Million Rye Project. Now, a rye is an area like a hectare, but much smaller. And their ambition initially was 1 million extra rye by 2050. So we said, okay, let's go beyond that. Would it be reasonable for us to think about having 1 million rye every 5 years instead of by the end of the project period, or every year, or upscaling it even further? And then what we did, this is important, is look at the agroecological zones, look at the areas that are bioclimatically sensible to increased organic rice production. Now, one of the problems we have in terms of global analyses is that people don't do that. So, of course, if you pick random areas and you try to expand production, then, of course, it's going to be detrimental both to the environment and livelihoods. So this is an analysis that starts by saying, okay, your aspiration is to increase organic production in this area by this amount. Where would you do so? We then ran the analysis, and typically as an economist speaking to agronomists, the main concern they'd have with organic is what happens to yields? We can't afford this. Now, our analysis shows that as long as you pick areas in Thailand that are bioclimatically sensible to increase rice production, the organic only has a yield loss of between 1% and 3%, which is basically the margin of error in the analysis. Okay, so the yield loss is not a reason, okay, for us to push back on this initiative. What's going to happen to the biodiversity? This is a bit of a no-brainer, but remember, we had the opening to the conference, we're talking about evidence-based analysis. So this is us actually using data and collecting information on site to look at insect biodiversity. And we've got the 4 scenarios. Remember, the ones that red was the most extreme positive scenario. As you get more and more organic, unsurprisingly, you get more and more insect biodiversity. It's shown in this slide. And this is the kind of thing we want to do in India. We're not quite there yet. Okay, it's a really simple graph. Okay, and most people can understand this. It's like where we've got business as usual on the one side, we've got the organic on the other side. What happens in between? You've got this massive increase. Okay, an increase in livelihood benefits. Now, a lot of this is coming from health benefits because we don't have stubble burning, which of course is important to anyone living in Delhi. We don't have stubble burning under organic. And therefore, we don't have the PM 2.5 particulate matter. We don't have what we can measure as economists, differences in quality adjusted life years, which mean that they have an impact we can measure and then quantify and value. Okay. We also know there's the pesticide poisoning goes down. So the health impacts are huge. But the other impacts are also important. There is a net positive impact on carbon sequestration and storage. There's a net positive impact in terms of soil fertility, hydrological services, etc. That is captured here. This is what we need to do, I think, to try and make the case for the interventions that policymakers have looked for us to investigate. So we've achieved some impact already, and I'm going to come to the India study last. So this is a nice slide which shows President Lula, okay, signing a presidential law, and he actually signed 3 presidential decrees, all of which use the teabag food analysis, okay? They're linked to urban and peri-urban agriculture, linked to national food security. So with food, so this is presidential decrees that President Lula has signed. And so this is an idea of real extra impact, okay, that's occurred, which you wouldn't have avoided otherwise. And this is us showing that we can actually get to the point in terms of the Brazil study, which is now completed, where change can happen and can be instigated in terms of laws on the ground. So that's been very strong in terms of impact. The next slide, when we come back up, is a slide for Indonesia. So in Indonesia, what we've had is the inclusion of agroforestry for the first time in the 5-year midterm development program. So Indonesia is important because A, it's an incredibly biodiverse large country. They were looking to make the case for agroforestry. We know that there's an opportunity cost because if you don't have agroforestry, there's other things you don't want in terms of the global marketplace, which take the place of agroforestry. We made the case. They took that case on board. They wrote to us and thanked us and included it in the 5-year plan. They're hoping to include it in the plan for transformation up to 2035 as well. We're then working with them, or we're now working with them in South Sulawesi to decide specifically where we're going to have the upscaling of cacao agroforestry. Okay, so this can work. And we've already had 4 years of study in India, and it's been incredibly successful. We're very lucky because we've got a second phase of the project, which is funded by IKEA Foundation. So the work in India, and I'm going to turn to finally, I think is really important. This is where I want to get your attention and your inputs in terms of our work. So the work is being led by a team that's based in Delhi. I'm based in Geneva, as I said, but a team based in Delhi. We're looking at trying to, so this is the Indonesia one, looking at how we can actually integrate change. Now, what you see here, I'm not going to read out on the left-hand side, partly because of time, is all the things we hope we're contributing to. So when we have, I'm going to come back to the slide, okay? There it is. So when we have these stakeholder consultations, all right, we start with saying, what exactly are the policy initiatives that you want evidence on? And then from that, what exactly are the scenarios which are viable for us to look at? So this is a level of engagement at local level, at national level, at state level. There's lots of state level activity, but also globally, they see some of you actually attended the workshop in Thailand we had towards the end of last year. So going back a couple of slides again, this is where we're operating in Uttarakhand, Uttar Pradesh, and Assam. And on the left-hand side is the various things, the various interventions, policies, which we feel will provide economic evidence to support overall. So as I said, the modus operandi is why I present Thailand. Develop a scenario, co-develop a scenario that makes sense, do the analysis, and see if actually there's evidence to make the economic case for transformation. So here is a list of, it's a very long list, right? In the different states, what we're looking at. And this is why I think it's important to think about the TEEB Agri-Food Framework, because the reason we developed it is because we couldn't find another one that was comprehensive and inclusive. Okay? So for me personally, I didn't think the health impacts were going to be that important. But when we did the analysis, the health impacts are massively important. So we're looking at all of these changes because these, in some, tell us about the wealth of India. the wealth of these states. Because for an economist, the wealth isn't the same as the income as measured by GDP. Okay, so the wealth is by the World Bank, the UNEP Inclusive Wealth Report is linked to these capital stocks that we have. We should measure the stocks, we should measure the flows that occur with the stocks, and that tells us how well we're doing in practice. So this is what we're being measuring. And we had to develop and co-develop scenarios. So you see here the kind of scenarios. And again, we ask our policymakers, what is viable? Let's just not do, sometimes it's nice to do blue sky horizon thinking, right? Just tell us what's optimal. This case, it's like, this is viable, this is doable, these are scenarios. Now, just to be clear, I don't think actually optimistic and pessimistic are the best definitions, best tags, I should say. Optimistic isn't just things go well. Optimistic means you allow for in all three scenarios, you allow for things that are baked into the system. You allow for climate change, okay? So we're using RCP 4.5, 8.5, many are familiar with those, UNFCCC scenarios, different levels of climate change. We know urbanization is going to take place, okay? We know there'll be dietary change. We know there's going to be demographic change. All of that is the background that's baked into our models. On top of that, we heap on what we're calling optimistic, which is good stuff. You actually change the rules of the game. You make the case for agroforestry. You make the case for organic. You push for funding and intervention so that grassroots involvement and uptake of these. That's what we're calling optimistic. And in that scenario, we have the changes you see here in terms of the amount of agroforestry increase and organic increase in these states. Okay? Sorry, state. I'm just doing Uttar Pradesh because of time. And pessimistic is just if things go wrong, how wrong could they go? There's some of the things that are baked in might actually get worse. So I'm going to flick through, just in terms of Uttar Pradesh, it's a complex thing. What I think is really important, this work has been done in part by ICAR. Now that's really important because as you know better than me, the Indian Council of Agricultural Research is an apex organization. If they take on this research and lead this research and include it within, insinuate it within its own mechanisms, then it gets mainstreamed. Now, we actually steered through UNEP various tools, various mechanisms we can use in terms of all the different models you see on this chart to get to the analysis we need to get to. And here's a quick kind of three look. We looked at different agroecological zones just for the sake of simplicity. I'm presenting one, okay, and in Uttar Pradesh in terms of Meerut. And you see, obviously, just eyeball it. You'll see massive benefits in terms of carbon sequestration and storage from our scenario. Next slide. Just have a look at this again. The blue shows you the percentage change in the optimistic scenario, say 8.5. This is a 27% net change in water provisioning. Just think about that. To have 20 to 30% more water relative to not intervening is a hugely big deal. Yeah, we know how reliant our cropping systems are on water availability. That can happen through our models, at least it's showing it can happen if we act now. And by 2050, the difference is even larger, okay? Reductions in soil loss. There are many in this room who are experts in soil loss and how important soil loss is. So the differences are, again, huge. Look at some of these, kind of 58% in one of them here, or 81% by 2050. We're avoiding that soil loss. Now, I'm not presenting the valuation here. We're going to try and improve the valuation side of things. This is the biophysical, but it's specific to what exactly has been asked for by our co-steers, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare. This is the second last slide, on a thanks slide. We also feel it's important, as I said, ICAR has been leading this work. We're in discussions now with other entities to take the work forward going forward from the Ministry of Environment. Now, we have mainstreamed this. Why? Because if you look at the penultimate bullet here, 51, there's the last bullet, TBA is included in the syllabus of undergraduate program for natural farming by ICAR. So 51 state universities and the agricultural extension workers who are going to be leading this work. So tomorrow's future, statology, but the future of agriculture in this country, they are learning about this TBA approach, looking at ecosystem services, looking at human social capital, understanding why it's important, and in so doing, hopefully treading a path so that you, the people on the ground working at ground level, will have those agricultural extension workers trained in that, and hopefully you can convince them that agroecology is the way forward. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Simon. And sorry to rush you through the last slides, but we want to give some time for the interaction between and thanks for wonderfully explaining that the language of positive and negative numbers in in observing and explaining agriculture, which works actually better than sometimes the language of ecology and other things. Sometimes we may need a mix of this. Next, we are moving to Dr. Drupad. As I told you, I have got a teaser of it. In 2000, I never visited that time any of the Himalayan hills, but Dr. P.S. Ramakrishnan from NEHU and from JNU later, he came to KFRA, he was a board member, and he was giving a presentation to us about the Apatani tribes, which was actually the best energy efficient community system of producing rice. He was counting the joules of input and joules of output. And, with a jaw dropping situation, I was watching this. Later, I had been to those places, got introduced to these communities. But even 8 or 9 years of traveling through those landscapes and introducing those communities, the slides of Dr. Drupad was eye opener for me. And we invited him to do, the same to you all. And welcome, Dr. Drupad.
Thank you, Hari. And thank you for inviting me here. Right. It's a pleasure. I think I feel privileged to be presenting to you today in such an august gathering. I'm going to talk on something which is on the fringes and not in the general discourse that you usually hear. I'm going to talk on indigenous people's food systems and an outcome framework that we have tried to put together. The background is the 2021 United Nations Food Summit. And as you see in the concluding statement of the UN Secretary General, given the negative contributions of contemporary industrial agriculture, which we heard in the morning from Morgan and from you, sir, there was a clear recognition that agriculture has got to transform. So what do you look at? What are the possible options that you have or models that you can look at? And the UN Secretary General pointed out on certain of the good practices, those systems, particularly indigenous people's food systems, that can provide nutritious food for billions of people while safeguarding biodiversity and the other critical systems. However, as usual, the scientific community was skeptical. And they said, well, we still require evidence. So given that background, the organization that I'm linked in at the moment, the Indigenous Partnership for Agrobiodiversity and Food Sovereignty, took up this challenge. And we conducted a multi-country assessment of the indigenous people's food systems in those countries, using the FAO-developed agroecological performance evaluation tool, which was accepted by the high-level panel of experts of FAO who had been central to the UNFSS. Now, this tool and the assessment was done in 4 countries: Thailand, India, Kenya, and Mexico, right? Although it was a small study compared to what we required to really generate, but nonetheless, it covered about 500 households in 16 different landscapes, right? And the idea was that we have got to generate evidence to show that there is something that the indigenous people's food systems can offer. I'm very happy to report that having completed that, what we see is most of the food systems that we studied have very high scores. And the high scores are in areas where you find that it is moderate to high scoring, but particularly in human values, the social values aspects of food systems. But when you get down to the details, you find that the score is very high on diversity, is very high on recycling efficiency, is very high in terms of the integration with other systems. Now, when we talk about that, you look at where have they performed, and then you align that to what the UN food systems, the 5 pillars or action areas that the Food System Summit had talked about, and you find that there are actually quite a substantial contribution that the indigenous people's food systems can provide, right? Also, what you see is that these the areas where they have high scores are essential components when you're talking about sustainability. When you talk about resilience, we try to look into the value systems and the worldview of indigenous people. Tape could not capture that. So we had a complementary approach where we looked at storytelling. 3 countries, 30 stories which were covered. And there were some key lessons that we could, glean out of that. I won't go into all the 7, but I want you to look at 3. The first is when you talk about indigenous people's food systems, they're biocentric. They're not human or anthropocentric. In other words, the food system is around not just the crops, not just the other organisms which are there, but it is an all-encompassing approach. Whereas in our modern systems, the human beings are in the center of that. The second is that these food systems are collectives of both intra as well as inter-crop diversity, right? So you have a huge diversity of crop and varieties within that. But the last point or the key message that I want you to look at is what is the concept of resilience? And the indigenous peoples' world values and value systems tell us that they look at resilience by growing a respect and nurturing nature. Modern science tells you that you can preserve a place and nature by keeping humans out of it, right? So that's the basic difference which is there. Human beings are looked at as part of nature, not away from that. Given the inspiration from the storytelling and the enrichment from the tape, it was clear that indigenous people's food systems and the value systems that they have can offer critical approaches in transforming agriculture. They can also help in enhancing climate adaptation, and they can help develop food systems which are nature positive, which are resilient, sustainable, and transformative. Objectives that we are trying to achieve. More important, they can also contribute to global biodiversity framework and the sustainable development goals. Now, being encouraged by these results, we then embarked on designing an outcome framework. The first thing that we did was we went back to the communities. We went back and asked them, the food system that you have, what are the outcomes that you look at annually? Didn't matter where we asked this question, whether it was in Northeast India, whether it was in Thailand or elsewhere, all of them had 5 very clear outcomes. The first was that their food systems required to provide them safe, healthy, nutritious, and diverse food available across seasons, across the year, right? Second, healthy natural systems with rich biodiversity and sustained ecosystem service, something that you were just talking about, Salman, right? And they're very clear. They're not looking at numbers, they're not looking at economics. They say, if our food system does not give that, then we cannot achieve the first outcome. So healthy and rich biodiversity and sustained ecosystems are the other outcome that they look at. The third, of course, is in terms of income, which is based on green economy. And these are nature-based approaches. The fourth is something which is very, very interesting. They say the food system and diversity has to give us a strong risk aversion capability. Now, I'll give you a parallel. When your salary comes in and you invest some of that, you don't invest in one portfolio, you spread it, right? And the reason you spread it is because if one doesn't do well, there are others to balance the loss which is there. For the indigenous people, is the same logic and argument, but they're talking about crops and different systems. So they have multiple systems. Within each of those, they have a wide diversity of crops. And that gives them the risk aversion capability. Also, it enhances adaptive capacities and builds up the resilience of food systems and of the people. The last outcome that they look at, through the management of these food systems, they would want to foster and further strengthen the value systems that they have, and particularly the value of the spirit of sharing and caring. And the sharing and caring is not just among their community members, right? This is also the sharing and the caring of nature, which is central to the way that they approach food systems. So having done that, the outcome framework has a vision that indigenous people's food systems benefit people, nature, and climate. And it has two goals. The first is the positive impacts of IPS on people and the planet are valued, and any negatives are reduced. The second is that the positive impacts of socio-cultural values, traditions, and the governance systems of the indigenous people are valued and increased, and any negative impacts are continuously reduced. With this, we developed an outcome framework. The outcome framework draws from the TAPE results. It draws from the templates of solutions that we see among indigenous people food systems and the consultations with the elders and knowledge holders. It has 6 thematic outcomes, each with sub-outcomes within each one of them. And we also provide an indicative pathway of how you can reach those outcomes and indicators blending science and IP knowledge. So it's when you're looking at the indicators, you're drawing both from science as well as from the people's knowledge, which is there. And in the process, we have one more outcome that we look at, which is building up a cadre of indigenous people's young professionals who can then scale the. So let's get into what are the 6 outcomes that we are talking about. The first one talks of nourishing people, nurturing nature. And it's based on the indigenous people's value system that we nurture nature as nature nurtures us. And therefore, we have got to take care of each other, right? These are deeply rooted on the harmonious relationship that indigenous people have with nature. They have the ethics of coexistence, and it's based on harvesting for needs, not for greed. It's not exploitative. It's across a spectrum of scales, from species, systems to landscapes, and there are numerous templates of solutions in each one of them. What are the pathways that we are suggesting? This is simple. When we talk with the communities, they talked about the importance of diversity, of maintaining diversity, of soil health, and therefore they become important pathways. When we talk about managing diversity, we are talking not just of seed banks, but we are talking about living gene banks. So setting up heritage landscapes in these areas, right? You talked about how you're approaching in Thailand, right? And this can be another parallel that we can draw in terms of how you build up the heritage landscapes in there. I would just like to talk a little bit on the pollination services, because it's very interesting how these communities are doing the beekeeping. Beekeeping is something which is quite common. It's not a rocket science, right? But whether it's the Karens or it is the OGX in Kenya, they keep the bees in log hives and they keep them in the fallows or the forests, right? Now, in addition to nourishing people through honey and other products, they're also nurturing nature. Because with the pollination service, what happens is the foraging activity of the bees ensures that there is pollination, there's fruit setting, and that there's seed setting. It means through that, you're also helping in maintaining the health of the ecosystem, right? And that's why this is very important, although it sounds very, very simple, right? Move on to the next. Improve nutritional status, good health, and reduce malnutrition. And what you see when you are looking at any of the indigenous people's food systems is a very rich diversity of wild edibles and neglected and underutilized crops. If these can be domesticated and brought into school gardens, kitchen gardens, then what you're talking about is a ready and improved access to nutritious foods, income support, and you're supporting a circular economy, but also, and I think this is very, very important, you're reversing the dependency of those rural communities on nutritious or nutrient-dense crops being brought in from outside. So the external dependency that you talk about has been reversed, right? You do that, what you're doing is you're empowering and enhancing community resilience. Now, a very important pathway is the school meals. And this is a program which is, quite popular all through, not only in India, but also in several other countries. Now, what is different here that we are talking about compared to the ongoing programs? All we are saying is introduce the wild edibles, introduce the neglected and underutilized crops as part of your school meal. Promote that through home gardens, through kitchen gardens, to school gardens. But also, we were before lunch talking on the PDS system in one of the sessions, and we were talking about procurement, changing those procurement guidelines to ensure that it becomes localized and you help getting these, wild edibles which are grown locally or the underutilized crops which are available there. It will help not only in terms of nutrition, it would also start the circular economy and make them more self-reliant. So the next one that we are talking about is green livelihoods. If you look at indigenous people, they have knowledge, they also have skills. And it is harnessing this knowledge and skills which can promote a lot of the green livelihoods. However, a caveat here is involve the youth. Involve the youth as the main drivers, with branding and digital technology acting as the force multipliers, right? This is where I come in with the livestock. When you look at the landscape, the indigenous people's food systems are more than just conventional agriculture. It's a mosaic, right? And a mosaic which is of agriculture, regenerating fallows, young and old forests, pastures, and water bodies. And these offer a tremendous opportunity for looking at how you can have adaptation brought in, how you can have reduction of emissions, and also the linkage with other systems. The pathways we suggest is scaling up the landscape management approaches. Early warning, I want to take just a little bit of time here. We have, over the last few years, looked at many of the extreme events and the disasters which have come about, right? What we need to do, and also one more thing that I can add is, insurance, crop insurance, is not perfect yet. And that's because we don't have enough information at the local level. And what we are suggesting is if you involve the youth, the school children, for example, for monitoring local level weather, link it up digitally with your existing meteorological station, you have a mechanism perhaps for early warning, which is more effective. And then among indigenous communities, the social network, harnessing the institutions that they have as bridges between the community and the government for early response. But all this is not possible without responsible governance and value-based driven decision making. And I think the indigenous people's governance mechanism is something that we can learn from, because when you look at the governance, it's based on customary norms, and these customary norms have two things which are central to them. One is the universal and equitable access to resources. The second is sustainable use of resources. And therefore, what we need to do is we promote inclusive governance mechanisms based on that. One tool that we are suggesting is participatory perspective land use planning. That brings about universal access to land as well as tenurial security. The last outcome that we are talking about is intercultural learning, knowledge management. And that's for a very simple reason. When we look at indigenous knowledge, it is experiential, it is empirical. And the knowledge is built with generational experience. When you talk about scientific knowledge, it's experimental. As scientists, we can afford failures. Our salaries are coming in. But for the indigenous person or the rural farmer, they cannot afford failures. They will only retain those approaches which work. And therefore, if we can bring about the synergizing and infusion of modern science with indigenous people's knowledge, you have several opportunities for co-creation of solutions and templates of solutions. There are many, right? I'm just also giving you a glimpse of indicators that you use for performance, for baseline and for performance. Here, what we have got to do is have an amalgamation of scientific indicators as well as that of people's indicators. For example, when you look at soil health, one of the things that the rural farmer or the indigenous person tells you about is they look at the presence of certain plants, they look at the presence of animals like earthworms on the soil, or the sense of smell. What smell do you get from the soil? And I was just reading 2 weeks ago on the science behind smell. There are compounds which give you that smell, and those are quantifiable. So if we are adding these two together, people's knowledge with science, you can have indicators which can be even monitored by the farmer or the indigenous people out in the rural areas. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Rubat, for an enlightening presentation. And really, certain words have, struck me very hard, like, the biocentric approach, the rules of coexistence. I remember the 7 or 8 hunting rules of Adi tribes, which makes really like hunting not just not just hunting, but a sustainable resource extraction from the landscape. I don't want to get into the details of it. Some of these topics have been close, connected with the presentation of which Amba Jamir has done, and Ami Amchi Arogya Sati about the backyard kitchen, gardens and all, because the learnings are going. But the point is, very important point, what Rubat makes all the time is this knowledge, the knowledge from these systems are getting eroded and getting vanished. And there needs something to be done. Otherwise, we will lose the valuable resources for the food system transformation, which we can use. Without losing, without taking too much of time, I would like to invite Brand for his presentation. I always used to compare the food system as with fractal. The more you go inside, it will show you the same complexity. the national food systems, the subnational food systems, the district, local, village, even family, and even individual, our emotions and our food, interests are also connected. So the more you go, you zoom in, the same kind of complexities will be revealed. But a wonderful effort to realize that at least at the global level, every nation has different sets of solutions which are required to address this puzzle. A wonderful presentation is waiting for you. Brent, over to you. 15 minutes, a little more. Thank you.
Hey, Ari, how are you? That was a nice, example about the fractals, about the food systems being the same at, different levels. Great. All right. Thank you very much. I'll just very briefly, I don't have a whole lot of time here, but I'll very briefly and very high level talk to you about some work that we've been doing on that we're calling Solving the Great Food Puzzle, really focused on actions in different countries and different places. And it's really focused on the implementation side of things. Now, we're all sitting here at the summit. We're all talking about food because we all have a direct connection with food. And one of the reasons that I love to work on food personally is because, it's something that we can all talk about. I used to live and work in Borneo and worked a lot with the Dayak people and focused a lot on orangutan conservation and, tropical resource management. And, of all the things that we talked about, the number one topic by far was food and culture, food and health, food and kids, food and rice. And one of the things that I started to realize that, maybe I can tackle the same kind of problems, the same conservation issues. We can save those orangutans and we can save those elephants by focusing on food instead of focusing on things like forests. So I believe food is the number one vehicle that we can have if we actually want to transform the world and our own health. Now, the Living Planet report, I'm not sure if you guys have heard about this, but it's WWF's flagship report was just launched last Thursday. And from what I hear, it received quite a bit of press in India. Some of the results are quite shocking. One of the results, and it's really showing a system in peril, is that the average decline in wildlife has been 73% since 1970. And this average, very gradual decline, rapid, decline in wildlife populations is directly linked back to food systems. Now, the impact of food systems, whether you're talking about greenhouse gas emissions or you're talking about water or you're talking about health, it's all the same. By far, the number one threat to people and planet comes from food, the food that we eat and how it's produced. Now, that's the bad side of the thing. The good side of the thing is that therefore food can be the biggest solution that we have out there to fight the biodiversity crisis, to fight our health crisis, to fight like the climate crisis. And it must be a massive part of the solution. Now, for the past many years, I've done a lot of work at the global level, attended the COPs, really trying to get food on the international table. And I think the global puzzle is actually getting solved, that food systems for the first time are being talked about. Food systems are being addressed. The seriousness of them is actually being, finally talked about. However, and that's a good thing. I think that global puzzle is at the very high level getting solved. However, where I think less work has been, the focus is, what does food system transformation look like in different countries around the world? Because obviously food system transformation will look vastly different in the US compared to India, compared to South Africa, compared to Bolivia and Colombia and Brazil and Indonesia and Vietnam and Philippines and Sweden. And what we need to start putting together and understanding is that this is all a massive great food puzzle, where every single country, the cultural context, the political context, the environmental context are going to play into what the food system type is, and therefore what the solution should be. And this is a puzzle that we are trying to solve and that we've been working on for the past several years. Now, one of the challenges with food systems, which Harry indicated at the very start here, is they're extremely complex, much more complex than energy systems and other, types of systems. And we can get bogged down in some of this complexity if we're not, careful.
Brent,
And it's, yes?
Brent, sorry to interfere. Please make sure that you are in a presentation mode. I doubt you are actually on a, now, right, thanks.
There, thank you. Thank you for stopping me. food systems are extremely complex, right? And what is happening now is that we're hearing a lot of pet solutions that are being proposed. If we could only implement a certain type of production, regenerative agriculture is going to save the planet, or a certain type of technology, or a certain type of this. And it's really hard for policymakers and people working on food system transformation to navigate some of this, complexity, and to really understand what really works where and will have the most impact. And this is one of the problems that we're trying to solve. And I just want to show a very short video, which in a humorous way highlights the fact that with the Great Food Puzzle, we are trying to we're trying to fix the broken food system by making sure that we're using the right tools for the job at hand. So obviously, just like you're not going to put together a broken plate with a jar of jam, you're not going to go in and fix a food system with the wrong solutions or actions in like a given place. And the only way that we can do that is by truly understanding the food systems that we're working in and the people in place in which they're actually set. Now, the first step in terms of solving this great food puzzle that we did is, and to reduce some of this complexity, is to build a global food systems typology for each one of the countries around the world. And, again, this is done to reduce the complexity of food systems because there are so many countries. Can we go out and set forth and say, let's try and understand 195 countries, or can we reduce some of this complexity by grouping countries by food system type or by, similarities? This is an example of what we mean by like typology. If you want to group vegetables, you can group them by different characteristics. So you have your nightshades, you have your legumes and such. We can do the same for individual countries in terms of grouping them by various characteristics. Now, we group them around 6 different characteristics that we find to have the highest impact in different countries around the world based on international data sets. Things like food security, things like are they able to produce their own food within their borders, environmental performance, the amount of biodiversity they have within the country, the amount of carbon storage that they have. And based on these variables, what we did when we ran the international data sets against each other is you started to see countries that started to group in terms of the performance of those 6 variables against each other. And we got 6 different clusters, which you can see right here. Now we're calling them type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4, type 5, and type 6. And the reason that we're calling them food system types instead of giving them a name is we didn't want the names to get in the way of the food system types themselves, because people can interpret a lot with names. So each one of these clusters that you see right here from type 1 to type 6 perform similarly with the 6 different variables that we use to actually group them. If you want to learn more about this, the methods are all spelled out online, but I don't want to go into the details too much here. But this is how it ends up playing out in terms of the 6 different types and their distribution across the globe. You can see here that India is a type 3 countries, and you can also see the other countries that are also similar to it. Got type 1, the high biodiversity and carbon countries. You got type 2, type 3, type 4 countries, Mexico, South Africa, type 5, the US and parts of Europe, and then type 6. And type 6 countries are really characterized also by their ability to be able to produce a lot of food. They have a lot of land and a lot of food that they can produce it on. Step 2 that we did is we looked at 20 transformation levers, and we assessed the impact of these transformation levers in each one of the food system types. Now, we boiled down a long list of actions, and we've all read several reports out there, many reports that are listing actions. And what we wanted to do was not to propose a set of 60 or 70 or 100 actions that could be taken. We wanted to, again, reduce this complexity. So we boiled down all the actions that we saw across many reports, consulted with experts, and say, can we get them down to a manageable number of actions or levers? And we were able to reduce it down to 20, and we've tested them over the past couple of years, and we feel like they're fairly solid. We've got 4 under natural resource management, 4 under governance that you can see here, 4 under education and knowledge, 4 under technology, 2 under trade, and 3 under finance. So for all the countries, we then went and we consulted in-country interviews. We did surveys, we did one-on-one talks with experts around the country, policymakers, business leaders, academics, NGO workers, farmers, to say which one of these actions would have the most impact in your particular country. Then using the food systems typology, we were then able to say, well, let's look at the potential impact of the levers across the different food system types, which you can roughly see here. Again, more of the information can be found online. What you see here on the left side are the 20 levers, and on the right side, those colors is the impact potential for each one of the levers. The highest impact potential is dark green. The lowest impact potential is lighter green or yellowish, if you can see it there. Now, it's important to note here when we're looking at these, we are not, all 20 of these actions are important for food system transformation. However, most countries don't have unlimited resources and unlimited time to be able to implement them. So therefore, what we're saying is that if you had to prioritize key actions that will have the most impact in the shortest time possible in your food system type, what are they? And those would be the darker green that you see here. Now, another short video just to reinforce the fact about why we're trying to find the highest impact actions to have the impact in the shortest time possible is done through this short humor sketch. Obviously, we're not going to hammer a nail with a carrot. That doesn't make any sense when you look at it like that. But I think we can all think of examples where we look at a particular action or fundable project that has been implemented in a particular area, and we wonder, why was that particular project implemented in this place? It ultimately failed. And sometimes it does feel like we're trying to pound that nail with that carrot because it doesn't make much sense to be able to use those tools or actions. And then the very last step, obviously, and the most important step probably of this, is we have to operationalize the Great Food Puzzle. And the 6 steps that we've outlined here in terms of operationalizing it, number 1 is to set your overall scale of focus. And with this framework that we have here, it can be used at the national level, it can be used at the subnational level, it can also be used at like the national, or it can be used at like the landscape level. Steps 2 and 3 is really building background documents and looking at gaps. So what do we know about the national level or landscape that we're working in? What is already there? Let's actually map existing efforts and policies that are in place, see what kind of gaps. Is a country or landscape or region focused on the actions that we're finding that will have the greatest impact or not? The 4th step is to look at the innovations that can amplify the impacts. Now, when we're talking about innovations here, we're talking about innovations much more broadly than just tech innovations. We're also talking about consumer innovations and policy innovations and business innovations, financial innovations. So we're looking at innovations much more holistically. The 5th step is building a roadmap, which many people are working on already through various avenues. And the last is to mobilize and also coordinate stakeholders, which is what you are doing with this very important summit that you're having in India. Now, we're hosting a lot of national dialogues on this, and the idea with these national dialogues is to gather stakeholders to look at the results of the Great Food Puzzle, to map out solutions, to see what's in place. This is a national dialogue that we had in Pakistan the end of July. We had one in the Philippines in June. South Africa is going to be next week. We've got one going on in Mexico, November 12th, and one that's going to be in New Delhi on December 17th. We've also had national dialogues in Vietnam and Zambia as well, and Kenya, which will be coming up soon also. So the idea is to bring stakeholders together, look at the results, and see how can we focus on the impacts and the actions that will have the most impact in the shortest time possible. Now, just very briefly looking at India, which is one of our countries in focus. It was a food system type 3. It is a food system type 3. Now, when you look at some of the top transformation levers in India, of the top 20 or of these 20, You can see how it ended up playing out based on national level results with experts and the surveys, is these are some of the levers that had the most impact or that are seem to show that will have the most impact. Two are under natural resource management, that's optimizing land use, including use of waters and also fertilizer, increasing diversity on the farm, moving towards farming systems that are much more agri-diverse and much less monocrops. Under governance, smallholders was action that received overwhelming support. It was one of the most talked about actions, the need to support smallholders. And that's connected over to the finance lever that you can see over on the right-hand side, which talked about the need to address subsidies and financially support farmers if we're asking them to make this transition towards agroecological methods, organic methods. We have to be able to support them, through that. We can't assume they're going to take all the risk. 3 education levers were high. Interesting in India is the science and data are very important levers. That were shown by experts that are not only needed, but what we also need to move forward. The highest impact lever of all of them in India was actually the one tech lever, developing supply chain infrastructure. That's cold storage techniques, that's roads, and many experts felt like a lot of the problems could be solved, or you could lessen the impact just by working on infrastructure. So that was the number one lever that we found. Now, a few reflections that we found in India. The first one, directly related back to subsidies and investments, was from some experts that said a lot of farmers know about these natural farming, and that they need to go towards more natural farming systems, nature positive production. However, that type of farming is very risky for them. And again, coming back to this idea that we need to support farmers with assuming some of that risk, and we can't assume that they're going to do that without financial support. Another lever in terms of strengthening science and research is that the agricultural research system in India is the largest system in the world. And that, however, most scientists are trained in old ways of doing farming and not new ways. So we need to pivot towards that. The third thing is promoting healthy and sustainable diets. A lot of people felt like this is a top issue in India. A lot of focus has been on production, less on consumption. However, in India, demand is the most important side. And that's something that more focus should be put on moving forward. Now, lastly, I just want to close with a success story, which focuses on the number one impact lever in India. It's developing supply chain infrastructure and just some of the amazing work which is already being done, the place-based work which is being done in India.
Brent, sorry to interfere. Maybe 1 minute.
Yeah.
1 minute more. Thank you.
Yeah.
Very perishable commodity. The problem is if we don't have a sufficient infrastructure and power energy where milk can be chilled, the milk will go bad and its value becomes zero, and it's a loss to the farmers.
जिस समय हम लोगों को बिजली की जरूरत है उस समय बिजली नहीं है।
अब कभी कभी एक कैन खराब हो रहा है, कभी 2 कैन खराब हो रहा है। जैसे एक कैन भी खराब हो जाता है तो उस रोज हमारे को 3,500 से 4,000 रुपए का नुकसान हो जाता है।
इस समस्या को कैसे समाधान कर सकते, तो हमने 3 सोलर लेके हमने फील्ड में फिटवेट लिया। आज वहाँ पे 99% रिजल्ट अच्छा आ रहा है। उससे आज महिला खुश है, किसान सेक्रेटरी खुश है और कंपनी खुश है, और उनका भी दूध की कीमत बढ़े ताकि वह जैसा दूध निकलता है वैसा दाम उनको मिल सके।
We've got 60 more success stories like that online, and this is growing. We encourage you to go online and check out our new tool. The tool is a way to really provide a easy user interface to go in and look at the different countries, what actions will have the most impact in the various places, to read some of the success stories, to watch the very short videos on them. And this will be growing as we work with a lot more individuals around the world. We already have businesses that are approaching us that want to do a business case for this, to look at if you're a business working in some solution, what should they be focusing on. We have cities that want to do a city version of this. So a lot of interest in this at the moment in terms of really trying to find those solutions that will have the most impact in the shortest time possible. So that I want to thank you for this, for the time, and just encourage each one of you, and just to say, please help us to solve this great food puzzle. And if you want to know more, you can go to the website, or you can go ahead and reach me directly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brent, for that informative, presentation. And sorry to rush you because we are 15 minutes behind the timeline right now. So I think before closing, we can take 2 or 3 pressing questions. Please limit yourself to questions. Reflections can be later in person. You want one? Ajay ji.
I have a question to both the panelists that in both your presentations, I think so you missed the economics, the profitability part, livelihood part of the farmer in the sense, or I missed it.
So my question is to Mr. Hussain. Sir, I saw your framework. I mean, all of you, the presentations were really wonderful. Only I just wanted to know the various parameters, the social, cultural, those you have, the weightage is given same. That I wanted to know, because that will differ person to person, country to country. So I just wanted to know the weightage for all the parameters.
One more pressing question in case you are, yeah, here.
Yeah, I think both the presentations talked about women's empowerment, and I would like to understand how exactly are you measuring empowerment indicators? Because even in the gender space, there is a lot of challenge in terms of, and therefore, is it something that is casually being put in as one of the impact indicators, or there has been some serious thinking and understanding on what is the way to measure empowerment?
Thank you. So 3 questions. First is related to profitability, livelihood. Second is wage rate to social and cultural. And third is the women empowerment. Both of you.
Thank you so much for the questions. On livelihoods, the first question, and income and finance, that's an integral part of what we're looking at, in the sense of what we're trying to say is that can you make the case to have the private sector and public sector to make it financially sensible to shift options? So, for example, the question in terms of PM 2.5 and burning, and that is a direct cost which occurs to the health service. That is a real cost which appears in the GDP accounts. So as long as you do an attribution there, then it's actually a positive sum game as opposed to a zero sum game. And there are benefits there in terms of income. Now, what we're trying to do is say, instead of that sitting there as being non-attributed and just being a cost which is hidden, let's try and make that cost visible and make sure as a consequence we change the income patterns. So there's another further response from bioeconomy, what we're doing, but that's a separate one. But I think we do try to deal directly with how livelihoods are being impacted and try to improve those livelihoods. On weightings, there's actually no weighting per se. So what we're trying to do, again, some values will be measured in monetary terms, some non-monetary. And we are trying so far as we can do that, because typically monetary valuation tends to be most powerful for decision makers. So if we can have some monetary valuation, we will. And we're trying to do that in terms of across all 4 spheres. But we try to think of no net loss, in the sense of, if there is going to be a situation where, say, for instance, social capital declines at the expense of human capital, then we try to interrogate that change and see whether it's actually something we ought to advocate for or not. And there's a link there to the third response, which is women's empowerment. There's only a snapshot of what we're doing, but one of the things, for instance, that ICAR are doing in their work, which we find very interesting, is they have their own way of measuring agrobiodiversity. And the agrobiodiversity measurement includes, say, for instance, women's empowerment, which we can give you further details on. So that's explicitly being measured. And, we're part of the UN system. So in terms of the UN system, certainly it is paramount of importance that we do that measurement. We can give you further details. We can talk to Ruben and Shivani, my colleague, directly in terms of technically how we're doing that. But that's certainly an important part and a component part of what we do in all our work. But thank you for the question.
Drupal, do you want to make any comments?
Just very quickly on livelihoods, one of the thematic outcomes is on income and livelihood. So that's very specifically looking into what are the opportunities that you can have based which are nature-based livelihood opportunities. But apart from that, all the other three that we talked about, whether it's in terms of nourishing people, nurturing the nature, or in terms of the improvement in nutrition, there are aspects of livelihood which comes in all of them, right? On women's empowerment, if you remember the second last outcome that we talked about, it's there in the others, but that's very specific, looking at how you can empower women more in terms of bringing in decision making or their participation in decision making, in resource, your access to resources, and the choice of what sort of livelihoods they're going to have and which they pick up, right? So details, when you look into the outcome framework, there are aspects where it's addressing what you're here. I just, given the time, we can just, give you a sort of just a glimpse of what there is, right?
Brent, you would like to make any final comments over these three questions?
Can I ask Brent a question? Is that allowed?
Yes, please.
Yeah, there's one more question coming to you. Yeah,
Brent,
please.
Yes.
Hi, Brent. Brent, I was going to
Hi
ask,
there.
I was working with your colleague Zhao Campari a lot on Action Track 3 for the food system.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And I just wonder the following, because when we look at the global map that you have, obviously you're familiar with the fact that many countries, 100 plus, have done food transformation pathways, national dialogues. So in those dialogues, I mean, how do you avoid repetition in WWF? In a sense, those dialogues have brought together stakeholders, asked exactly what the triggers are for food system transformation, looked at where the obstacles are for the impediments to change, and tried to tackle systemically those. So how are you building on the conversations in the Food Systems Summit that have already taken place? Thanks.
Yeah, this is a fantastic question, because there's no shortage of dialogues, are there? Feels like every organization out there is running some sort of dialogue. And one of the things that we are doing with them is making sure that in each one of the dialogues that we have, that we are working with and connecting with the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub. And we are working with and making sure that we are building upon what's already there. I would say that some of the food systems dialogues that have been in place, and some of the roadmaps that are there already, some are definitely better than others. As you know, I would say that some are pretty comprehensive and some are pretty thin. And what we're trying to do is not be repetitive. We're trying to make sure that let's take what's already there, the information that they already have, and let's build upon that. One of the things that we've already seen, though, is that sometimes some of the actions that we found that have been a focus area of some of those food systems dialogues are more based on something that the government's already working on, a specific interest from like a stakeholder group, or maybe a key, I don't know, donor or something, but it's not necessarily, we're finding that it might not be specifically the action that will have the most impact. So we're trying to take these dialogues that have already been in place, take them to the next level, and say, as we continue these dialogues, can we maybe pivot the conversation, make it a bit more refined, and say, what are the actions that will have the most impact in this country? One more thing is that the same is true for NDCs and NBSAPs. If you look at the NDCs and NBSAPs that are out there, food systems are not represented, and some of the times, some of the things that they are focusing on in these is a bit of a head scratcher in terms of why you're focusing on this action for your updated NDC. What we're trying to do is say, with the updated NDCs, which will be going in over the next several months, maybe can we focus on actions that will have the highest impact in that place? So that's a very good question, and the more streamlined that we could be with this, the better.
Thanks, Brent. And we know that you are going to do a dialogue in India as well. And as mentioned earlier in our communication, we have a database of stakeholders, people who have very good, thorough understanding about the food systems, and we'll be always happy to share that with you for engaging with them or adding value to it. Thank you, distinguished speakers, Dr. Brent Loken, Dr. Dubrat Chowdhury, Dr. Salman Hussain, and my apologies for rushing you through the last slides, but it's a compulsion of the situation. Please forgive me for that. Thank you everyone for listening to this presentations, even if it is too late for you to reach back your respective accommodations, home or hotels. Parul is here to help us, and the driver's numbers in case you are staying in our hotel. Parul will be helping us to find the respective drivers, and the cars, all back home accommodation have been, arranged. Let's give a big clap to the distinguished speakers. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks all. Take care.